Okay, hello friends and colleagues, and welcome to this panel on issues around succession and decision making for applied anthropologists. In this session, we're going to start with a pre-recorded introduction, setting out a set of very thoughtful and well-put questions from Sam Williams, regional anthropologist at Northern Land Council. And then we'll hear from our panelists in turn, Emma, also of Northern Land Council, who I believe is joining us from Nhulunbuy, and Gareth, who was introduced yesterday and joining us from Darwin. The panel is weighted to the Northern Territory, and Sam's questions lead our focus further in that direction, and I'm sure it'll provide a detailed and rich ethnographic setting from which to draw case studies of contemporary succession and decision making.
Hello everyone, my name's Sam Williams. I've been a staff anthropologist at the Northern Land Council for the last 2 years. I've been asked to introduce this session, which is entitled Issues Around Succession and Decision Making for Applied Anthropologists. This is something that I cooked up with a few other anthros at the NLC as a session that will hopefully initiate a robust discussion around a particularly challenging aspect of our practice. My wife and I are due to have a baby in early February, and as such this is a pre-recorded introduction as I couldn't be sure that I'd be there in person. I should also say at the outset that the regional focus of my work is in Arnhem Land, part of the top end that's Schedule 1 land under the Aboriginal Land Rights Act. As such, I haven't had much engagement with native title in my work, and this introduction might have something of an Alra flavour to it. I hope that nonetheless it will be of relevance and interesting to everybody. Now I'll start by defining what I mean by succession, and then provide some context to illustrate what engagement with succession country looks like for anthros at the NLC, and some of the particular challenges that it raises. I'll then pose a couple of big questions for further interrogation by today's panelists. So, succession is an established social mechanism to deal with the consequences of demographic fluctuation. When the last member of a patriline passes away, for example, ownership of the deceased estate passes on to a new group of people. A variety of rights or interests might be put forward as the basis for claims to succeed to that country, to inherit ownership and responsibility for the deceased clan's estate. That's long been discussed in the literature, and it's been examined in a number of land claims and native title claims, so I don't want to go too much into that today. My interest rather is in how land councils and rep bodies deal with issues related to succession in the post-claims era. To illustrate, let me tell you about the uranium-rich country of West Arnhem Land. This is a place where the stone country meets the floodplains of large rivers, abundant in rock art, and long the subject of intense interest from minerals companies. Indeed, the Land Rights Act itself originates not far from this area. There's an estate within this part of Arnhem Land for which the last member of the patriline of this family passed away more than a decade ago. For a time, 2 of her children exercised decision-making responsibility over this estate without too much dispute. These 2 men have both now passed away themselves, leaving a group of people who call that country Maka, father's mother, or Kakak, mother's mother. In the last few years, a new interest group has begun to aggressively assert a claim to ownership of this estate. This typically plays out in mining meetings about exploration on this country. Meetings have increasingly escalated into verbal abuse and occasionally physical altercations, particularly where money has accrued from exploratory work on this land. A couple of 100 kilometres to the east is a beautiful island town surrounded by blue ocean with many songlines stretching out to distant smaller islands. Home to about 1,000 people, this town is on the country of a group for whom there is only one remaining patrilineate. She's a 40-year-old woman, but she's never lived in that town, and she knows very little about her father's country. The decline of her clan is largely historical. Some 100 years ago, groups from the east migrated to the island, leading to violence and destructive demographic decline. Landowners were driven to reside on the mainland to the west, and Eastern groups established themselves as the authoritative leaders of the island community in the early days of the Methodist mission in the 1920s. These Eastern groups continue to assert themselves in the context of ownership of the town today. NLC meetings are regularly the forum at which various groups or individuals take time to speak loudly and strongly about the legitimacy of their relationship to that country and to reject others. Groups are earnestly positioning themselves to succeed to that estate when the last patrilineal passes away, and this battle plays out before her at meetings. Now, these are just two of many examples within the NLC's administrative region, but they are illustrative of some of the modern issues at play when undertaking applied anthropological work in succession areas. With the advent of township leasing, Land Council staff are increasingly asking traditional owners to make decisions about activities on their land, and these decisions often have significant and long-term consequences. Government policies pushing a development agenda and the insatiable demand of mining companies for exploration licenses have huge implications for succession country. Where once succession might take 2, 3, or 4 generations to be fully settled, land use agreements force the issue. They rapidly accelerate the timeframes within which positions must be voiced about succession, and they distort the process. There is very little time for any consensus to form, and fertile ground for dispute and argument to be seeded. And then we come to money, royalties accruing from activity on succession land. The Land Council is bound to disperse any money accruing from land within 6 months. But how do anthropologists give advice on such matters when succession is unresolved? And we can't be naive to the fact that the receipt of money is often perceived as an explicit validation of one particular position by the Land Council and the implicit rejection of others. Peterson, Keane, and Sansom write in their 1977 article on succession about the rules on the basis of which legitimate succession can be justified. These rules are so distorted in the contemporary sphere as to be almost unrecognizable. Succession raises many complex issues. It gets to the heart of some of the most complex disputes. And this is often compounded by the fact that our practice is largely reactive and unreflective. We don't give ourselves much time to critically interrogate these questions. We largely work within timeframes defined by proponents rather than those set by traditional owners. In doing so, we generate disputes that can have damaging consequences for many years. The intention of this session is to create an opportunity to critically engage with these issues and to develop a set of principles for more rigorous, considered engagement with succession land in land councils and rep bodies. And to finish, I'd like to pose 2 questions that might be discussed in the remainder of this session by our panelists and with comments from the floor. Firstly, who sets the time frames for succession? Often we feel that we operate at the whims of proponents and mining companies, but I hope we would all say that our job as anthropologists is to work with and for traditional owners. If succession was historically a process that might take several generations to resolve, what can we do as anthropologists to push back against the pressure for immediate decisions? What can we do to create space and time for competing positions to be properly discussed? What can we practically do to give traditional owners the best opportunity to form consensus? Who sets the timeframes? And secondly, what is our role in facilitating succession? Should land councils and rep bodies be taking instructions from the last member of a patriline about future responsibility for that estate? To what extent do we uphold the traditional rules of succession in a changing and disputed environment? Are our meetings the right context within which to have these conversations? Or would this be better kept at arm's length from land councils and all their associated activities, land use agreements, royalties, and the like? What is our role in facilitating succession? Now, the benefit of being junior in your career is that you can pose all the hard questions without being expected to give a cogent answer. And to do that, I'll now hand over to today's panelists to share their thoughts on these issues. Thank you.
So my name's Emma King. I work at Northern Land Council. I'm currently in Gove, Nhulunbuy, the site of successions that have been documented for almost 100 years and are still outstanding in one form or another. But what I want to cover, I'm just having a little bit of problems with my screen here at the moment, is really look at Sam's question about who sets the timeframes. So his question, who sets the timeframes, strikes right at the heart of an uncomfortable truth for anthropologists working in land councils and rep bodies. I'm going to try and focus on some broad practical aspects of working with succession groups at a land council or rep body. The reactive nature of the legislative framework in which applied anthropology is developed means we don't get to set the timeframes, and consequently, neither do the Aboriginal people engaging in this legislative process. As such, applied anthropologists working in land councils and NTRBs participate actively in facilitating consultation and decision-making amongst Aboriginal groups in the context of the various legislative frameworks in which we work. Whilst the nature of our work is reactive, what we can do is influence the internal processes adopted by our organisations to best accommodate traditional or normative systems as best we can, where those systems are spotlighted by the legislation. When a succession is present, decision-making structures are in a state of flux, but they are not absent. In acknowledging succession and the change it brings to the decision-making framework, we can begin to develop a set of protocols or processes for engagement and consultation and decision-making for our deceased estate, where legislative roles and development agendas are unavoidable. Our role where succession is occurring translates as an active facilitation role, bringing succession players together to negotiate transitional arrangements for caretaking, variously referred to as regency agreements, management, caretaker, or custodial arrangements. Successions can be a high stakes and a fertile ground for disputes. Any facilitated process should not be viewed as a finite one, but rather a long-term participative process undertaken with the groups involved. Because of this, it is equally important to not create unqualified expectations within an organisation or among external stakeholders that facilitated succession discussions are a one and done consultation or meeting. Operationally, the majority of successions require long-term resourcing in order to effectively manage the process in the context of legislative duties and development agendas. If at all possible, early identification and prioritisation of consultation with succession estates may prevent disruptive and costly disputes. Where the decisions of organisations are reviewable, such as under the ADJR or PGPA Acts, or are likely to attract challenge through a complaints process or the legal system, it is well worth staff anthropologists developing a defensible organisational policy and procedure to guide engagement with succession estates to support decisions made through a facilitated process. Board members and regional elders of a land council or NTRB should be involved in the development of succession protocols. Protocols should seek to find balance between the traditional or normative succession process and the legislative frameworks and timeframes in which we operate. In all cases, solid ethnographic research and consultation must be the foundation for any consultative process undertaken by a Land Council or NTRB, and it should form the basis of succession protocols. Now, all this seems very administrative and bureaucratic, but increasingly this is the environment of Land Councils and NTRBs. Additionally, the increased scrutiny of anthropological practice in the legal system demonstrates the need for staff anthropologists to be proactive in developing organisational policy and procedure on matters which require specific anthropological expertise to navigate. If anthropologists can lead the way in developing the policies that affect engagement with constituents and clients, it provides an opportunity to influence how reactive timeframes impact on applied anthropological practice, and to an extent, the lives of constituents and clients. It can also provide a long-term structure for addressing matters such as succession in a manner that recognises and allows for the changing nature of rights and decision-making where a deceased estate is concerned. So that's my 2 cents. Over to Gareth.
Thanks, Emma. Am I ready to go? Great, thanks, Emma. Yeah, like Emma and Sam, we're all have our history of working in West Arnhem Land, and it's a particularly, I guess, vital example of where succession is extremely common, given that estates are very small, and being strictly patrilineal, they're subject to demographic fluctuations and change, and succession is a vital part of, I guess, a matrix of land ownership, which slowly but surely changes over time. But I guess despite this commonality, succession is not a simple or formulaic process. Sometimes it may be, and it can be resolved by a set of agreed straightforward principles. But most of the time it appears to be, it really emerges as being complex, a negotiated process, and it may require protracted timeframes, even generations to resolve, and to, I guess, acquire acceptance amongst a broad regional jural public. So I guess I'm looking perhaps towards Sam's second question a bit more about the role of anthropologists and land councils, or rep bodies. And addressing this, I guess, I'd firmly believe that matters of succession should be very much in the purview of in-house anthropologists, who ideally will be embedded for the long term and able to monitor, record, and at times contribute to the succession process on the ground. Of course, consultants may be invaluable for aspects of the process, but I guess it's the continuity and the corporate knowledge of the in-house anthropologist that should never be undervalued. And I guess the in-house anthros, they can play a critical, if at times cautionary and sensitive role in at least seeking to contribute to the process by facilitating meetings and engagements. Not necessarily to push or hasten the process, but hopefully more to determine if and when the community wants assistance in the resolution of succession matters. There's, I guess, a pragmatic balance, which Emma's referred to, that there is a need to get on with business and to get on with things. So hopefully there's ways you can find to do that. Problem is that too often in-house anthropologists' fieldwork calendars are chockers, at least for NT Land Council staff, anthros, it's ELAs and Section 19s with very little room for community-driven matters such as succession. In my experience, succession matters generally don't really get addressed unless they're part of a claim, whether it's land claim or native title, and too often fall into the too hard or low priority bucket and do not receive the attention the community would like them to. This has often led to delays which see perhaps the last patriphiliates passing away or other key regional elders passing away before their views are recorded or detailed, and their knowledge rendered, which may have rendered the succession process clearer and more sustainable amongst the broader public. I think it's also been, I guess, generative of at least or at least contributed to the fermentation of disputes amongst potentially competing successors, especially if the stakes are known to be high, where there's a mining proposal or there's royalties, as Sam discussed. And we've had some pretty huge historical cases like Emma referred to in Gove, in Kakadu, and other places where there are very large mining royalties at stake. So I guess it's in this manner that recognising the need for and resourcing anthropological research on succession becomes a critical part of the management of land councils, rep bodies, and their anthropological resources. Succession matters have the potential to be degenerative disputes which can render decision-making processes difficult or impotent, but not absent, as Emma said. Whilst in-trained succession processes themselves also have the tendency, in my experience, to make the successors to be highly conservative in their outlook, often seeking to respect the views of their deceased forebears. Both, I guess, problems can lead to disrupted or ineffective consultation processes, or the more expensive end of this protracted path of disputes and attempts at mediation, which can cripple budgets and stymie land council or rep body processes entirely. I guess the most obvious tool that's, I guess, become available in my experience is where succession is incomplete or in dispute, is to seek some sort of holding pattern. Sometimes in particularly formal situations, it may amount to what could be described as a regency arrangement or a management arrangement, but often it's a bit less formal than that. There are a number of cases like this in Kakadu that I've experienced over the last 20 odd years, so that decisions can be made even though the succession remains in place. This has been successfully argued in some certain land rights claims where the Land Commission's findings in a land claim provide a snapshot in time from which the land councils are able to extrapolate and monitor in-train successions as they develop over time. So that's an important part of, I guess, an important difference between, the land rights process and the native title process. Native title determinations are more difficult and perhaps require more nuanced attention. It begs the question, can an in-progress succession or contested succession be effectively determined under the native title? I've not done it. How would the anthropologist present such a scenario, and can you get it up for determination, or is it just something that we can't even get through the determination meetings? Can we argue that potential successors do hold some form of native title rights on a contingency basis, with the contingency being the resolution of succession by the overall native title holding group at some point in the future? But I guess where disputes are too much, I guess it's unlikely, as I said, it's unlikely to get through a determination meeting, and presumably the claim would either be abandoned or modified to exclude the contested areas and proceed in areas where there isn't contest or succession. At Pine Creek, I was able to resolve succession matters as a means of dealing with contradictory early ethnohistorical records around that town. And that's, I think, was a really critical part of being able to get that determination through. And I think this seems to be an important and thankfully broadly recognised aspect of native title connection reports and determinations. Chatting with colleagues, I understand that there are claims that have been put up where, I guess, more broadly accepted as, where caretaking roles or extended processes of succession which may remain in train have been accepted. I think the Newcastle Waters area is one of those. But I presume that the determinations of such claims have been possible because the succession processes in them aren't in dispute and are well accepted across the relevant claim groups. And that's been, I guess, been able to be demonstrated either in the court or through the consent determination process.